Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Governor Asa Hutchinson.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Zackheim, Director of the Reagan Institute. The Institute is home of the Reagan Foundation in Washington, D.C., just across Lafayette Park from the White House. I hope all of you will have a chance to visit us someday. We opened up in June, and we're awaiting your arrival. Now, as is our tradition at the library, in honor of our men and women who defend freedom around the world, please join and stand with me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Before we get started, there are a few people in the audience I'd like to recognize this evening. Former Congressman Elton Gallagher and his wife Janice, thank you for being here. Great to see you. And of course, the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute, my boss, John Hybush. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan nominated 31-year-old lawyer, a graduate of the University of Arkansas Law School, to serve as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Arkansas. He became the youngest U.S. attorney in the country. In that role as federal prosecutor, he was expected to uphold the Constitution and rule of law, but maybe not to make national headlines. But that's exactly what he did in the high-profile prosecution of the white supremacist organization, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. Most notably, he put on a flakjack to negotiate the end to an armed standoff involving local, state, and federal law enforcement. And that brave young prosecutor would go on to serve 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives before President George W. Bush appointed him director of the Drug Enforcement Administration and an undersecretary in the Department of Homeland Security. But he couldn't stay in Washington for long. So he returned to Arkansas to run for governor, winning in 2014 and again in 2018, when he received more votes than any other gubernatorial candidate in the state's history. Most recently, there we go, we can applaud that one. Most recently, he's chaired the National Governors Association, someone who's a true kind of governor's governor. Now, though the circumstances of each job has varied greatly, Asa Hutchinson has always shown a similar fearlessness and commitment to the mission at hand. So as he concludes his governorship due to term limits, he's naturally thinking about his next mission. What is next? The Republican Party is facing a similar question. After the losses in 2020, and the failure to meet expectations in 2022, what should the Republican Party stand for? This speaker series, which we launched in May of 2021, is designed to answer that question. Now, if you've joined us for the Time for Choosing series before, you know this series takes its name from Ronald Reagan's famous 1964 speech. You know that televised address launched his political career, a career in which he galvanized the conservative movement, reshaped a party, and transformed the world. Today, the Republican Party is again facing its time for choosing. Will the party only look backward, or like Ronald Reagan did, focus on the future? Will it prioritize principles or partisanship? Many leading Republicans have joined the conversation. Names like Haley, Scott, Christie, Cotton, Noem, Hogan, Ernst, Pence, Ducey, and more. Tonight, we're honored to add the latest name to this roster, and our first since those midterm elections, Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 46th Governor of Arkansas.
Thank you. It is good to be back to the Reagan Library and Institute. Our 40th president has been an inspiration throughout my life. Thank you for making this library a place where we can all go, come for strength, and hope for a world that is at risk. President Reagan is remembered for his cheerful Morning in America view of the world. But he wasn't afraid to face challenges with a penetrating seriousness. He spoke of the burdens of everyday Americans facing things like record inflation, high interest rates, gasoline shortages, and disrespect abroad for American leadership. President Reagan understood that the American century was already underway and that the Soviet Union and totalitarian regimes like them were a fundamental threat to freedom-loving people around the world. While I just described our world in the late 70s, it could also ring true today. The American people chose Ronald Reagan to lead our nation in 1980. I was the Bentonville City Coordinator for the Reagan campaign. And I will never forget the optimism of that election night when America said, we need a new direction. From the day he took office, Reagan took the oath seriously, and he showed us all how much can get done when you don't care who gets the credit. The results were economic recovery at home, a renewed respect on the world stage, and a powerful legacy that inspires us even today. During those years, I was honored to work with President Reagan as a young United States attorney fighting domestic terrorism and violent crime. Roger, thank you for your leadership and your referencing that time in my life. I learned a lot from President Reagan, and there are many lessons that apply to today's world. We have seen another election cycle pass in America, and we all look forward to the peaceful transfer of power in the House of Representatives in January, which just might give us another Californian as our new speaker. And as the American people often do, we saw remarkable pragmatism in their choices. They rejected extreme candidates and voted for democracy and the future. Many Americans chose leaders who reflected the voters' dislike for a process that has gone from dignified leadership to the worst kind of schoolyard antics. The voters embraced leaders who were problem solvers and got things done. This is illustrated by the fact that no Republican governor running for re-election was defeated. In fact, favorability of the Republican Party is as strong as ever. By a double-digit advantage, the public trusts the GOP to handle our most significant economic and foreign policy challenges. True, there was not a national red wave, but there was a red wave in states like Iowa and Arkansas, where the GOP gained seats at both the federal, state, and local level. And I would add that there is a rising tide for the GOP in New York, where Lee Zeldin got over 47% of the electorate because he talked about things that people were thinking about, which was enforcing the law against violent criminals. One point needs to be made crystal clear this evening. The voters did not reject Republican ideas. They rejected some candidates because they did not embrace Republican principles. Historically, Republicans do not attack America's democracy. Republicans do not denigrate our political system. Republicans do not undermine confidence in America, and Republicans do not attack those institutions that are fundamental to the rule of law and preservation of our republic. Yes, the midterm elections reflect a victory for democracy and a rejection of those candidates who failed to understand the time. In other words, the last election was a time for choosing. It was a time for taking a stand, and when a nation feels divided, candidates must speak with clarity and work to unite rather than divide Americans. Elections are about choosing, and now we must understand it is a time for doing. We must aspire beyond our differences and create an America that is defined by our shared values of freedom, individual responsibility, equality of opportunity, and respect for the rule of law that allows us all to chase our American dreams. Today, we are called to renew our work to diminish the barriers between Americans of different race. Early in my career, while a young U.S. attorney, I investigated and prosecuted extremists who committed acts of violence against their fellow Americans. One such group was led by neo-Nazis who preached white supremacy and violence against law enforcement. When a time for choosing had passed into a time for doing, I donned a bulletproof vest and assisted in the negotiation and arrest of the leader of the group after an armed standoff that lasted for 3 days. I then prosecuted the leaders to the fullest extent of the law. I understood the risks to our democracy from those that undermined our principle of equality under the law. I will never understand leadership that chooses to diminish or divide Americans. And I will never understand why a leader would give credibility to such hate-filled extremists by breaking bread with them. Americans are doers. When it comes to individual responsibility, we must value the entrepreneur who dreams and dares, as much as we honor the worker whose sweat makes that dream a reality. From a policy standpoint, we have to make sure that every American worker has the dignity of earning wages that is more than what the government might pay someone to sit at home. For that reason, as governor, I declined federal assistance when it discouraged people from returning to work. The dignity of providing for yourself and your loved ones should be the cornerstone of liberty. During my time as governor, we spent less time talking and more time doing. We lowered taxes, reduced the size of government, kept our businesses and schools open during the pandemic, and over 11,000 new businesses have been created in the private sector. Our economy has expanded, resulting in lower taxes and a $2 billion reserve account. I have governed and led as a problem-solving conservative. To me, that is the essence of common sense conservatism. Don't overstep the limited role of government, reward and encourage work, and use freedom to pursue prosperity and the enjoyment of life. In addition to the new business starts, during the last 8 years, we have created more than 125,000 new jobs, and at the same time, we have reduced state government employment by 3,000 workers. And we did it while improving services. This was a result of a massive effort to transform government, to improve efficiencies, and to increase the use of online services. A wise man once told me, if you can find it in the yellow pages, then government should probably not be doing that. Now, while almost none of us have seen a phone book lately, the truth of that statement survives. Government simply tries to do too much. Another challenge we must face is the growing divide between rural America and our urban areas. I understand our small communities and farm life. I grew up on a cattle and poultry farm on the Spavinaw Creek outside of Gravette, Arkansas, a small town of less than 1,000 people. I learned what it was like to travel long distances to see a doctor or to have access to a hospital. And today there is an urgent need for improved health care in rural America. And despite this urgency, we see a serious imbalance between funding for medical education and research and the reality of where Americans work and live. Consider the leading causes of death in the United States since 2019, excluding COVID. These include heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, among others. The highest rates of these diseases are in the heartland of Middle America. In other words, communities with the greatest health risk are rural. By reason and logic, we should expect our national resources for fighting disease be directed towards these states. But that is not the case. Currently, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, funds more than 50,000 grants at more than 2,500 universities and other research institutions. Yet last year, there were only 309 research grants out of 50,000 categorized under rural health. Grantees for rural health research included Harvard, Duke, Johns Hopkins, Dartmouth, and the University of Virginia. None of this is intended to be criticism of individual researchers or their universities, but I offer an idea for reform that makes sense. There are 60 million Americans, about 19% of the total population, who live in rural areas. Therefore, let's require 20% of all new NIH grants be reserved for health-related research among rural populations. This would not impact current grants, but this would help bridge the rural-urban divide on at least one important issue: health care. I have fought hard to expand rural health care in Arkansas, but it is a real need as we look across our country. Like many conservatives, I am concerned about the changes in our culture, whether that be limits on free speech on our college campuses or the undermining of the values I want to pass along to my children and grandchildren. And I've got 7 of them. I see those values undermined by a push for social engineering in many public schools. A quick look back in history tells us that the cultural war is not new. I remember being a part of the moral majority of the 80s that helped Ronald Reagan get elected. We were fighting the liberal agenda that was crushing down on us from the courts to academics. Well, what we see today is not new and has not diminished in importance, but the question always remains as to how do you contend for your beliefs. From a Republican point of view, the answer is you impact the culture through your individual actions, engaging your community, parents being involved in education decisions, and through your house of worship. A time for choosing is upon us every day. And unfortunately, too many are doing the wrong thing when they disagree with their neighbors. Too many on the right and the left are silencing opposition and, even worse, using and abusing government authority to do it. If you think a business is too woke, then don't buy their stuff. A conservative should not mimic the political left by using the power of the state to punish a business if the business is operating lawfully. Another lesson from the leadership of Ronald Reagan is the simple principle of peace through strength. I love the story about Helen Thomas and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan always referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. In his second term, he finally visited Moscow, and when he returned, Helen Thomas, the UPI reporter in the White House press corps, asked him, "So, Mr. President, what did you learn from your trip?" President Reagan replied, "Well, I found the Russian people friendly with a good sense of humor and wanting many of the same things in life that we do." Helen Thomas then sarcastically asked him, "Don't you wish you would have known that 10 years ago?" And his reply, "Well, Helen, they weren't that way 10 years ago." And that was his humorous way of saying America's strength made a difference in bringing down the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Empire. And let me tell you, it's not any different today. While I was in the United States Congress, I was asked by President Bush to join his administration. As part of the new Department of Homeland Security, I was called upon to protect America from terrorism after the 9/11 attack killed over 3,000 Americans. I saw firsthand how our military strength helped keep us safe in the homeland. And as I met with foreign leaders, I witnessed firsthand how united our allies were in support of the United States. They wanted our friendship and they followed our leadership. Since that time, the United States has veered off course. Our goodwill was damaged in the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and this administration's weak support for the protesters in China do not reflect the heart and soul of this great land. Today, America is facing enemies and threats that test our resolve, that challenge our leadership, and undermines trust between the United States and our allies. And yet, I have full confidence that Americans are up to the challenge. The United States is an extraordinary country. We are extraordinary because of our history and extraordinary because of our people. We are made of immigrants that have forged a new home out of hard work, risk-taking, and a love of freedom that comes from loss and sacrifice. Today, our welcoming spirit is challenged by a crisis on our southern border. It is a crisis caused by terrible policies created by the Biden administration and even worse, messaging. To fix the problem, you have to understand the scope of the crisis. We have to fix the broken asylum claim system where it takes 6 years in the courts to make a final decision. We must coordinate between the states and federal enforcement authorities on both drug enforcement and border enforcement. We have to break the cartel's control of the border, and we must expand the use of expedited removal for those who are not legally allowed to stay in this country. When you make these corrections, then you will see a more secure border. When I led the Arizona Border Control Initiative in the Bush administration, I never dreamed our nation could lose ground on border control, diminish respect for the rule of law, and leave so many migrants dying in the hands of human smugglers, devoid of any respect of life. We must, as a nation, do better. While at Homeland Security, I was sent to Europe to negotiate data sharing agreements to help us detect terrorist threats. As I had dinner with an official in the European Union, I pointed out that the United States was forged out of common values. I asked him what common values held the European Union together. He thought, because he had never been asked that question before, and then he said, European countries have in common two values. First, that there be no more war. And secondly, that the government has a preeminent responsibility to provide for its citizens. America is different. We are doers. We were founded with an unquenchable thirst for freedom, and sometimes it takes sacrifice to maintain freedom. And while we have compassion to care for the most vulnerable, we never want to rob any American of the dignity of their own self-worth. I think about the core values in our foreign policy. It is to protect our peace and freedoms in America, but we also understand a larger responsibility to do what is practical and realistic to support those who want basic freedoms across the globe. Our forefathers came to the United States fleeing tyranny, seeking freedom of religion, and pursuing dreams only available for those in a free land. And when we come from those origins, we see the world in a different way. That is why the United States should always support the oppressed against the oppressors. And that is why we must continue to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. The people of Ukraine have a right to decide their own future, and we know all too well the designs of evil dictators like Vladimir Putin and their disdain for American ideals of freedom. Ukraine must win. And when it comes to China, the communist leadership must know our determination to not allow Taiwan to become another victim of China's expansion. We also must fight for fair trade that requires those who participate in global trade to follow the rules. The picture I have painted this evening is similar to the challenges faced by Ronald Reagan. President Reagan's response to these challenges were to follow our conservative principles. I still believe that principles are at the heart of the Republican Party and that common sense and compassion win the hearts and minds of voters. In October of 1964, I was 13 years old, and I sat in front of our black and white television set with rabbit ears. My brother and I had our can of Gold Water in hand as we watched Ronald Reagan give the speech. His inspiration that night ultimately led me to choose conservatism over big government solutions and to choose a strong America over a country in retreat. Fast forward to the year 1992 in Houston, when then former President Ronald Reagan gave his last public address. I was there. I was there with my 17-year-old son named Asa. And he was there, and I watched as Ronald Reagan inspired a new generation. Reagan taught me a lot, but there are three important characteristics of Ronald Reagan that are so needed today. He was a consistent conservative, win or lose. He lost in 1976, he didn't change, and he won in 1980, and he was the same common sense conservative. So stick with your principles. He was also a pragmatist when it came to working across the aisle for the good of our country. After he was elected, Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill to get his economic reform package through. Most importantly, he was an optimist about America. Today, we need leaders who mirror Reagan, consistent conservative, pragmatic in governing, and optimistic despite our challenges that we face. We need leaders drawing us together based upon our shared values, not alienate us when we disagree. I share Ronald Reagan's hope for this wonderful country. Our best days are ahead, and America will continue to lead the free world because we must. There is no one else. As the famed Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, if America does not lead the free world will not have a leader. Some might find it a bit old-fashioned to close my remarks in this way, but I'm reminded of the words of an old hymn. In this free land by thee our lot is cast. Be thou our ruler, guardian, guide, and stay. To me, it makes a difference to understand and lead upon the providential care that we need in our individual lives and the life of our nation. So thank you, and may God bless America.